Yeah, a warm welcome from my side on this afternoon of the second day of Big-Data.AI Summit at Bitkom. I'm very happy to welcome very high-level speakers regarding the topic Gaiax and regarding the topic tech sovereignty to discuss in the next 40 minutes. The slot in the next 40 minutes consists of two parts. Introduction from Marco Alexander Breit from the German Ministry of Economic Affairs. He's responsible for AI and Gaiax at the ministry. And after his introduction, we will do a deep dive into a panel discussion consisting of Mrs. Nemat from Deutsche Telekom, Mr. Bolle from Bosch, and Mr. Pinkwart from the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs from North Rhine-Westphalia. So without any further introductory remarks, I would like to hand over to Marco Alexander Breit from German Ministry of Economic Affairs to give his view about the project Gaiax, the history, the background, and also talking about policies and regulatory schemes directly linked to Gaiax. Mr. Breit, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Klingholz, and for having me, and good afternoon to all the panelists and the people at home or in their office in front of their monitors. The topic of today is Gaia-X and how it impacts digital sovereignty, and I would like to start with a short explanation on what exactly we think when we talk about the digital sovereignty. The Chancellor has introduced her idea of digital sovereignty in 2019 at the Digital Summit, and she said, look, digital sovereignty doesn't mean that we need to do everything by ourselves, but it means that in the end, we need to be able to do everything by ourselves if we choose to do so. And if we take this seriously, then that means that we need to really distribute global value chains too. And this is not only true for cloud computing or IoT or semiconductors that we have been talking about for a long time now. You can see it at its best right now when it comes to vaccines. Regarding cloud computing and regarding European legislation, this is something you asked, Mr. Klingholz. We are now at the moment working on DSA, the Digital Services Act. We are working on the Digital Markets Act. We are working on the AI regulation. Everything I just mentioned is being negotiated on the European level. And if we want Europe and Germany within Europe to be digital sovereign, being the ones that call the shots, and not only receiving policy decisions, then we need to make sure that this regulation that we are negotiating right now has an impact, not only in Germany, not only in the European Union, that's for sure, but on a global scale. If we want to be sovereign, then we need to make sure that the economical power of the European Union has an impact worldwide. Still, although we can see that the global players like the US and China are becoming more and more, their relationship becomes more and more a rivalry. And if we want to make sure that we are digital sovereign, then the third pillar we should rest on is the impact of our competitive companies, some of which are on the panel that I have the honor to introduce right now. So if we take these goals serious, then we need to think about how we're going to achieve this. First of all, if we want a competitive European economy in the data economy that's coming in the next 20, 30, 40 years, then we need to address two things. We need to address scalability, something that we lack right now because the European digital single market has not yet fulfilled its promise. And the second thing is scalability is heavily impacted by the ability of companies to find the right people to make their ideas come true, to find money to make their ideas come true. And this is something where we need to step our game up because the United States, for example, but China too, have a huge advantage over the European ecosystem in that regard. And the second thing that we need to make sure is that we have access to data on a way broader accessibility than we have right now. That means if we want to establish innovative ideas, innovative services, when it comes to data, when it comes to AI, then we need to access to the data of small and medium enterprises, the access of data from academia, research institutes, the data of large-scale companies, of startups, and everything that could be of value for my service, for a data application, should be easy to access when the data relation that makes person or company A able to check the data and use the data of person or company B, it needs to rely on a data protection. At its best, the European data protection and European values. But we need to make sure that it's easily accessible. And this is something that we are lacking right now too, because right now we see a lot of global players that have a lot of access to a huge amount of data, because that data is processed within their infrastructure. It's processed with their services, and this mechanism that it's their infrastructure and their services kind of improves this data infrastructure and the services by themselves, because it's, again, not only a matter of scalability, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that the better data I have, the better I can learn, the better my services are going to get, and the more clients I can win over for my competitors, which makes my services better. So we need to kind of break that circle to democratize data worldwide, and we need to make sure that Europe has a place there. So the questions I addressed, and Gaiax is a very promising answer in our view for all these problems. Why so? Because at the core, Gaiax is not only about the digital infrastructure where companies and people can interact and have their data relations based on values, based on the European data protection, and based on a trustworthy environment. No, it's the second part of Gaiax, the fruitful ecosystem that we try to achieve. What gave Gaia-X its name, Gaia, the Greek goddess of fertility and nature. When we can establish an ecosystem amongst equals, where small and medium enterprises, big companies, academia, I mentioned them all, can interact with each other, have data relations, exchange data, work on concrete ideas together. It's easy, interoperable, data is easy to migrate, things are going to be, can be brought together very easily and handily. Then we can earn all these innovations, into the fruits of innovation that right now are only being harvested by companies of way larger scale, because they have the access to all these tools, bring them together. But we want to democratize these data relations. We want to democratize the access, and thus bring equals together working jointly on innovation. In the end, the goal that we try to achieve is we want to make sure that in the data economy in the next 20, 30 years, the services that have impact, the services that people use, are coming not only out of Europe, not only out of Germany, but out of Europe. Because we think, again, this is the issue of scalability, that a single company is too small, Germany as a nation is too small, but Europe has the minimum viable size to make scalability work. And this is why we are very proud to have established, after the birth of Gaiax as a political idea within the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy, we established a Franco-German alliance to foster the idea. And right now, Gaiax is based on a Belgian AISBL, which is an Association sans but lucratif, a non-profit organization with 20 founding members. 2 of them are on the panel. And it kind of exploded from 2 member states and 20 founding members to more than 14 member states, 22 nations, bringing more than 220 companies together. And this is the first step only that we achieved with Gaia-X in March and April this year. So right now we need to work on the technical specifications. We need to work on the use cases, which my federal ministry will accompany with 200 million for use cases based on the Gaia-X infrastructure. We need to work on the standardization, and we need to work on the ecosystem amongst equals that I have been talking about. And this is why we're very happy that especially the German federal states are aboard the Gaia-X train too. And I'm very happy that, for example, North Rhine-Westphalia, for example, Hesse, or for example, my home state, the Saarland, are very interested in taking part of the Gaia-X national hub in Germany that we established too. This all brings together a huge ecosystem, or the first steps of an ecosystem, and it shows One thing, it has been a political idea, but right now we could hand the idea over to the companies. They are interested, they are working hard, they feel that this is the way to go if they want to establish a strong position in the data economy to come. And this makes us very proud. And I'm very happy that we can work together jointly on this idea for a European digital sovereign ecosystem. Thank you. And I wish you a fruitful discussion on the panel. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Breit. There was a lot of very interesting points. You mentioned, on the one hand, Europe, when it comes to regulatory schemes and industrial policy, and on the other hand, scalability, which also heavily linked to Europe. So I think this is a very good introduction, very good start for the discussion we will now do a deep dive into. We have, on the one hand, Claudia Nemat. Claudia Nemat is a member of the management board at Deutsche Telekom, and she's responsible for technology and innovation in this context. Furthermore, we have Dr. Michael Bolle. He's also a board member, in this case at Robert Bosch, and he's responsible for technology as a CTO and for digital issues as a CDO. So my first question to both you panelists is, what opportunities do you see in the project Gaiax for Europe's digital sovereignty as a whole? And what potentials do you see for in the project Gaiax for the European economy in particular? Starting with Mrs. Nemat for sure.
So, and nowadays you will find on the risk radar of many European companies things like, number one, the geopolitical conflict between the United States and China, which actually impacts global trade and global supply chains. Second, challenges around supply chain shortages, especially in the semiconductor arena, which is driven by COVID-19, but also through rising demand. And last but not least, we have a very lively discussion about Schrems II, which is the ruling of the European Central Court stating that the data privacy needs of European citizens are not sufficiently protected by the US legal frame. Now, the letter could have significant implications on our way of collaborating with US tech players. So what does that have to do with Gaia-X? Obviously, Gaia-X does not solve all those challenges, but I believe that Gaia-X can be a significant contributor to addressing those challenges. Why? Because Gaia-X defines rules and standards how we want digital services to be operated in Europe. And by the way, it's really inclusive because these standards and rules apply for everyone, European companies and non-European companies who want to do business in Europe. So therefore, I believe that we have now a very good frame in place. What is important is that we are now coming from concept to execution. And in order to get there, it is incredibly relevant to have use cases and business models that scale and solve real practical problems. And by the way, as a company, we see plenty of opportunities there, specifically also in the public and in the healthcare sectors.
Thanks a lot, Mrs. Nemat, for the view of Deutsche Telekom on this. We will do a deep dive in the further discussion regarding the role of Deutsche Telekom within Gaiax. And I'll now hand over to Mr. Bolle to give the view of Bosch regarding the issues of digital sovereignty in general and the view of the European economy in particular.
So first of all, I would like to highlight the points mentioned by Claudia Nemat. These are fully supported also from our point of view. I think one of the really driving forces behind Gaia-X is to build up a huge and common data economy and digital economy in Europe. And the important element of this is that this data economy has been and has to be based on European values. And for the data itself, it means it has to be secure, it has to be encrypted. And finally, this ensures that this data and the data infrastructure can be trusted by consumers, by business partners. So for us, it's a very important means in order to establish digital trust for consumers and for business partners. And this for us is a key enabler for the growth of digital economies in Europe and also worldwide. And the other aspect I would like to highlight, where we are really convinced that this will be a success factor for Gaia-X, is the notion, first of all, of distributed infrastructures, which basically opens up possibilities also for further partners, and we will see this later on. And the second element I would highlight is that we are convinced that open technologies, especially open source technologies, will be a big driving force in Gaia-X in order to enable technologies. And this has been pointed out by Claudia as well, in order to become very fast, not to develop everything new and from scratch, but using existing technologies. And one of the effects of this data economy, in our point of view, is that this is the basis in order to enable the major driver of innovation and differentiation in Germany and Europe in the future is artificial intelligence and machine learning, and that the access to data and the exchange of data in this context, driven by Gaia-X, is very important.
Thanks a lot for those two introductory statements. I just summarized three things. We will do a deep dive into those things during the next considerations. One thing is the policy rules or the compliance with Gaiax, the compliance and trustworthiness of cloud in Europe. One thing Mr. Bolle mentioned is the next generation of cloud, decentralization of cloud. And the third thing is, which is an overall thing from my opinion and also from your opinion, I guess, is speed and time to market. So we will jump to the next question, which is addressed to Mrs. Nemat. And the question is, we talked about Gaiax a lot on the high-level perspective now, and very particular addressed to Deutsche Telekom. Deutsche Telekom has a cloud strategy, has a cloud offering on the market. How does Gaiax concretely affect the cloud strategy of Deutsche Telekom in the next years? Also considered European partnerships you started last year, for example.
For a number of services, and of course also a big infrastructure building. I just want to mention two very practical examples to make that tangible. During that COVID-19 crisis we are experiencing, everything goes digital and we are sitting in front of video conferences the entire day. So we have also a Gaia-X compliant video conferencing solution called Jitsu. It's open source. It comes with embedded end-to-end encryption, and it is DSVO compliant. Talking about partnerships, we did that together with OVH from France and SAP, and we are convinced it is a complementary solution to all the video conferencing solutions we are experiencing. Another example, and Michael Bolle and I were just talking about it, is of course the big project Catena-X, formerly known as the Automotive Cloud, where many industry players, automotive companies, but also enablers like Deutsche Telekom are coming together in the attempt to really create an open, secure, and sovereign data ecosystem. For example, very practically for the exchange of data with regard to spare parts, etc. So that would be an industry example. Maybe I should say we strongly believe as a company in the principles managed by Michael, which is the sovereignty and security, because without that, I believe there will be no trust in the digital economy. And I can only emphasize it is very important that we all, as human beings, as citizens, as well as small and large companies, can actually transparently decide for which purpose they share the data for how long. And that is for me the key principle of data sovereignty. And I find it very important for our European values here, as well as, I would argue, for the value of any liberal democracy in this world here.
Thanks, Mrs. Nemat. Very interesting insights in both the cloud strategy of Deutsche Telekom and also very interesting remarks regarding overall policy frameworks. So I would like to address the same kind of question to Mr. Bolle regarding Bosch's concrete perspective, concrete role when it comes to Gaiax. Bosch has at some point a different view maybe, because Bosch is both the user and the supplier of platform and cloud. And after you answered your question, Mrs. Nemat mentioned it, we can do a deep dive into use cases linked to Gaiax as Catena-X too.
Yeah, so maybe a short background on our cloud strategy. So what we are doing today, and this is the practice of many industrial companies as well, is to combine public clouds on the one hand side and on-premise storage and on-premise clouds on the other side. We call this hybrid cloud, which is, I would say, in the old world, the perfect setting. If you have access to your data, you can define your data, and you have your own data ecosystem. And if we look into future systems and future setups, we see that the notion of exchange of data between business partners, between governance and business partners, between industries, will become absolutely key. So this hybrid cloud concept, has to be brought to the next step. And in our understanding, Gaia-X could be and will be a means in order to do this. And why is this necessary? Think, for example, in the current legislation set up by the European Union in the direction of CO2 footprint of services and products. If you look into the details of this, look, for example, in the automotive industries and cars, you will recognize that these products are composed of a huge number of components. And if you want to really determine the footprint of the overall product, you need the footprints of each individual product, which leads to a huge number of individual footprints. And if you want to track this and calculate this and also improve this, optimize this in the future, you need a heavy exchange of data between the business partners. So the classical hybrid cloud concept for companies individual will not make it. We need to install an ecosystem which allows change of data, and Gaia-X is, in our view, the right mechanism in order to do this. And in this setting, like implemented in the requirements and specifications for Gaia-X right now, each company can define the data it wants to share, the services it wants to share, and obeys itself to the rules and regulations of the Gaia-X services as well. They stay the owner of this data, but based on the Gaia-X mechanisms, now the business partners can exchange data without having to extend their cloud infrastructure, for example. And this, in our understanding, is a big lever in order to optimize, especially entry cost for new partners entering the systems, but also infrastructure cost and setting up cost in order to implement this connected ecosystems in the future. So this is the reason why we believe in Gaia-X as a key mechanism. And we also believe in the strength of the federated services of Gaia-X, because they can ensure that the same standards in respect to this data are ensured by all partners, being it cloud partners, being it service partners, being it data partners.
Thanks, Mr. Bolle, for those very interesting considerations and also the views from Bosch in particular. I'm now very happy to warmly welcome Professor Dr. Andreas Pinkvard. He is the Minister for Economic Affairs, Innovation, Digitalization and Energy of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. And North Rhine-Westphalia is also involved in Gaiax since some time, and therefore I'm very happy to ask him how he sees Gaiax and which potentials he sees in the project Gaiax for North Rhine-Westphalia, and which public sector projects which are planned and scheduled at the moment are linked to Gaiax, and how these concretely works when it comes to interaction with Gaiax.
Yeah, thank you very much to being part of this great panel with Ms. Nemat and Mr. Bolle. That's a great pleasure for me. And I'm sorry that I had the delay. But for me, it's the same as Mr. Bolle mentioned. Gaiax, it's very important. As we know, the big providers of cloud services, a lot of them are based in the US or in Asia. And their business model seems to be based on once you're in, we make it as hard as possible to get out again. And there exactly comes Gaiax in the play. And it's designed to tailor services to the needs of businesses and individuals without such a lock-in effect. And I think that's wonderful. And Gaiax is setting up a network of European cloud providers ready to do business in accordance with and in spirit of European regulations and our European values. And Gaiax, and that's for me in North Rhine-Westphalia very important, has strong roots in our state. There are partners with Gaiax located here with the headquarters in North Rhine-Westphalia from the company side, but also from the research side. Gaiax was initiated from French and German players. Now it's becoming more and more European, which we support strongly. And furthermore, I think digital sovereignty plays a more and more important role, especially also for our industries, which we have and which highly depend on digital tools of big data, analytic opportunities, of the opportunity to share data much better with others, but staying autonomous in a high sovereignty. That's important for medium-sized companies, for the hidden champion companies. And therefore, Gaiax is a great solution for the next step in the digital world.
Thanks, Mr. Pinkwart, for those insights. And I think you touched a variety of points we also touched in the beginning, and we want to do a deep dive in these points too, when it comes especially to trustworthiness and compliance with the European legislation, compliance with goals which a cloud service customer wants to see in his cloud, like data protection, information security, portability. So, Mrs. Nemat, if you could give us some insight, you touched it already, but if you can give us some more detailed insights in concrete compliance issues which Gaiax wants to solve and which makes a USP, a Gaiax compliance service, a USP for the customer in the future.
So on principle, as I mentioned before, one big aspect which Gaiax is solving is the aspect, the compliance with data sovereignty, which is what Mr. Pinkwart describes, avoiding logins. Yeah, so that as individuals, as small and big companies, I can actually decide with whom I share my data for which purpose. And as Michael Bolle pointed out, sharing data across institutions and companies is fundamentally important if we want to solve some of the big issues we are currently experiencing as humans, like CO2 neutrality. When you look at the entire supply chain, you need an overview about the CO2 footprint of products and pre-products, and you need an overview of the ingredients. That overview and that transparency is based on sharing these information and the data. And then in combination with analytics, artificial intelligence, we are actually able to optimize the footprint. And as Mr. Pinkwart talked about North Rhine-Westphalia, I think there is, by the way, a phenomenal opportunity here, because we have here headquarters of digital leaders, we have headquarters of logistical companies, and we have headquarters of chemical companies. So I think it's a perfect match of capabilities in that location. But if your question is, how do we make sure that what companies are doing is really Gaia-X compliant, my assumption is there will be certification, there will be a label which states the certification. We would need to certify a number of things, the hardware, the connectors, the software, but also the architectural framework, which actually states that data sovereignty. And on principle, my assumption is that institutions that do those certifications, like audit companies or the TÜV, those would be types of institutions which would actually do the label for the certifications. In addition to what I believe, there will be also some self-assessment to provide a higher level of certainty. Maybe my last comment, because Michael Bolle and I discussed this before, it is really important that we take it serious and that Gaia-X does not just become a label, like greenwashing. This is really a real certification stating that this is compliant, and not like, now everyone has understood something needs to be called Gaia-X compliant and off we go. So that has to be taken really serious and be done properly. But I'm absolutely confident that together we will be able to do that.
Thanks a lot, Mrs. Nemat. This is a very good link to a question I just see in this chat, because I think it makes sense to combine those things when it comes to a concrete question regarding digital sovereignty and data sovereignty and members of Gaia-X. I'm just referring to what the person in the chat says. He's referring to Palantir and companies from China. So you mentioned concrete value-added designs of a Gaia-X compliance design. So what do you three people think when it comes to those rules and the international perspective of Gaia-X and international companies using this Gaia-X standard in the future, maybe in their overall global business strategy? Really the overall political strategy question addressed to the three of you. Maybe we start as Mrs. Nemat, you just shared your considerations with Mr. Pinkwart, then we go on to Mr. Bolle, and then we give you the time to conclude regarding this question.
Okay, excellent question. What I said at the beginning, the rules are strict and apply to everyone. The rules are being set according to the European values. One of those values is the idea of data sovereignty, which I just explained. Now, what is important, that it is, of course, also inclusive, meaning that any company in the world which is willing to comply to these standards and rules can participate. But what is also important, the rules are being set by the Europeans. So in a sense, it's very clear what the Spielregeln, the rules of the game must be. And then we need to have an appropriate certification process. But on principle, the idea was not to say no one can actually work with us just because the company happens to be outside Europe.
Thanks a lot for this very clear statement. So I will just hand over to Mr. Pinkwart and then Mr. Bolle to give their additional considerations regarding this overall global strategy perspective when it comes to digital and tech and Gaia-X in particular in this context.
Yeah, I totally agree on what Ms. Nemat mentioned. When interlinked with testable technical standards and norms for artificial intelligence applications, a further step will be taken toward trustworthy and reliable artificial intelligence made in Europe. And it can be the same as we have seen in the field of our data rights, which we gave the rules for the Datenschutz in data security in Europe. We at first were criticized, but nowadays a lot of American companies and others orient at these standards. And I'm sure that there's another opportunity for us, making sure that if you use cloud computing, you have to make sure that the trustworthiness is a big issue. And if we can establish these standards and stay close to them, I'm absolutely sure that other parts of the world would really like to be connected with it, will collaborate with it. And I think that's a great opportunity for the companies and also the countries in Europe to go forward and stay competitive, but also well aligned with other regions around the world, working on a common standard for these new technologies.
Thanks a lot. And now, Mr. Bolle, do you want something to add regarding this question?
I think it's a great question, and thank you also for the colleague in the chat posing this, because it gives us the opportunity also to clear up some misperceptions about Gaia-X. So the role and the target of Gaia-X is not to build up a cloud infrastructure in Europe, because actually we have high performance cloud infrastructures available from many partners. The target here is to set up a framework, rules, regulations, federated services, which allows a fully innovative playground for digital services in Europe. And that's the target of Gaia-X. And one of the concerns we have with some of the cloud providers is that companies end up in a certain lock-in. So one of the targets of Gaia-X and also our federated services inside Gaia-X is to allow a real fast and instantaneously exchange of the offers and make it abstract so that the services you are using do not have to care about the underlying cloud infrastructure. So this means, and Claudia named it, inclusive approach for the cloud infrastructure. That's definitely a property. But on the other hand, it means that all partners in Gaia-X have to obey the rules. And one of the perspectives of the certification definitely will be an amount of transparency. So the partners have to give transparencies about their internal procedures, about their internal measures in, for example, securing cybersecurity or ensuring that the data can be trusted, so that there are no open backdoors for other partners to look in this data. This has to be ensured. And if we have ensured this using Gaia-X and federated services, we have set up and built a playground for innovation in Europe concerning the services. And our firm belief is that the innovation will play in the services itself. So innovation will not be done by data alone. Innovation will play in the services using machine learning and AI. And we need this kind of data infrastructure, I would call it, provided by Gaia-X.
Thanks a lot. So given the time, I think it makes sense to address one last question to the three of you regarding use cases and sectors where Gaia-X is being applied in the future, or Gaia-X compliant services, guaranteeing all those things you just discussed, like data protection, data sovereignty, cybersecurity, focusing on use cases now. So you mentioned public sector and healthcare as potential use cases, Mrs. Nemat, and you are also involved in Catena-X. So if you could very briefly give us some insights into use cases, perspective in this, and then following up by Mr. Pinkwart regarding the demand of the state North Rhine-Westphalia when it comes to Gaiax compliant services in the future. And Mr. Bolle, you also already mentioned Catena-X, but if you can give us some last concluding statements regarding use cases, that would be a perfect wrap-up of the session, I think.
Yeah. So back to Catena-X, or formerly known as the Automotive Cloud. This is really about a larger group of industrial player, automotive companies, and then enablers like Deutsche Telekom, where the objective is to really look at the entire supply chain for purposes like exchange on spare parts, on ingredients in the components. For example, this is relevant when you have to recall something. So that is that big project. I also mentioned our video conferencing tool, and then my remark on the public sector and healthcare. I believe when we want to give real whoomph and drive something forward, the public sector itself should be a very relevant demander of services. And as we all know that there is a bit of upside potential in public sector institutions for digitization, I'm pretty sure that Gaia-X compliant services have plenty of opportunities in the public sector. By the way, one of my, being a mother of 2 children, pet projects here is a phenomenally functioning school cloud, which would hopefully not be different from school to school. But that is my personal remark to this.
Thanks a lot, Mrs. Nemat. And I think that's the perfect possibility for Professor Pinkwart to really show us how North Rhine-Westphalia is using his demand structure to enable Gaiax in the next upcoming months and years.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. So I can tell you that we have here a task force in North Rhine-Westphalia for Gaia-X applications, and we see for the public sector, we established here also initiated on the federal level permanent working group on cloud computing and digital sovereignty within the IT Planning Council. One main focus is a national cloud structure among the public sector. This cloud will take Gaia-X standards and the sovereign cloud stack, an open source backend of Gaia-X, into account. And we think that for our IT strategy here in North Rhine-Westphalia, which relies on cloud computing, the central cloud ecosystem will be provide linkings to Gaia-X. So for us, it's a real enabler for our future public digital system. And in addition, we see opportunities also to strengthen our data infrastructure. Here we got a feasibility study for data infrastructures in the Rhineland's former coal mining area. The study was published on April 15th. And the result is that this region is very well suited for data infrastructures, so especially for hyperscale data center. So that we think not only on the virtual part, but also the hardware behind the data infrastructure, both of them can be here used and established in North Rhine-Westphalia. And we really like to collaborate with the big partners in this Gaia-X network from the company side, but also from the federal institutions and the European partner countries.
Thanks a lot. So let us conclude with a final statement of Mr. Bolle regarding Catena-X, the automotive and manufacturing demand of cloud being Gaia-X compliant in the future. And yes.
Yeah. So I think first of all, I think it's very important that we talk about driving and also convincing use cases in order to drive an infrastructure project like we have in Gaia-X. So it's really important to combine, on the one hand side, the data infrastructure federated service of Gaia-X with application use cases like we have discussed, Catena-X and others. So that's really important in order to drive the demand also for the services and the data structures inside Gaia-X. So therefore, we see this in combination. On the one hand side, Catena-X and Gaia-X, and we have to synchronize it very closely. Second comment I would like to make is that in the future, we will see not only domain-specific solutions, so for example, in the automotive domain, but we will see solutions which cover many domains. And these solutions will really drive the demand for services which are not specific to a certain domain. So think of, for example, combinations of the public domain with the mobility domain if it comes to multimodal transportation. This would be an example which could which will drive federated services by Gaia-X. So we see Gaia-X also as a very important enabler for cross-domain solutions end-to-end. And therefore, beside automotive, we are very much interested in Gaia-X, and we see applications in industrial area, in the building technologies, and finally, last but not least, in the automotive domain.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Bolle. Thanks a lot, Mrs. Nemat. Thanks a lot, Mr. Pinkwart, for those very interesting insights, for the interesting discussion. And we are looking forward a lot to see the roadmap of Gaiax and to see how these things come together in the next months and years. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.